The crystal flute caught the light of the chandelier, sending a prism of colors across my father's face. He raised it high, smiling at the room full of Aspen's elite. "To family prosperity," Brian announced, his voice smooth as silk. I stood in the shadows of the ballroom, wearing a dress I had bought at a thrift store for $8. My mother, Alicia, caught my eye and gestured sharply toward a tray of hors d'oeuvres. She wanted me to serve, to help the staff. I looked down at my phone, checking my banking app. $12.43. That was my net worth. And as I watched my parents glitter in their designer couture, I realized the champagne in my father's hand cost more than my rent. Before we unravel this web of lies, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. You might wonder why a 27-year-old woman would agree to be a servant at her own family's party. You might wonder why I accepted living in a studio apartment with no heat while my parents bought their third vacation home. The answer isn't simple. It is a trap called normalized cruelty. For as long as I can remember, my parents didn't just control the money. They controlled the narrative of my sanity. They told me I was fragile. They told me I was broken. They told me that giving me money was like handing a loaded gun to a toddler. See, my parents, Brian and Alicia, are masters of the long con. They didn't just steal my inheritance. They stole my confidence to manage it. They sat me down when I was 18, looking grave and concerned, and explained that because of my emotional volatility, any access to wealth would trigger a manic episode. They called my poverty a character-building exercise. They called my struggle a necessary structure to keep me grounded. And I believed them. I believed that I was the problem. I believed that my constant anxiety wasn't a reaction to their abuse, but a symptom of my own defectiveness. So I became a social worker. I spent my days navigating the broken foster care system, helping kids who had nothing, and I spent my nights shivering in a walk-up apartment that smelled of stale coffee and damp drywall. I worked double shifts to pay for groceries. I walked to work because I couldn't afford to fix the transmission on my 10-year-old sedan. And every time I visited my parents, the sensory shock was physical. Their house smelled of expensive leather and fresh-cut lilies. The air was warm and silent, insulated by money. I remember one specific Tuesday last winter. I had called my mother, Alicia, in tears because my landlord was threatening eviction over a $50 late fee. I asked her for help. Just $50. She sighed that long, disappointed exhale that always made me feel 3 inches tall. She told me that bailing me out would only enable my dependency. She told me that struggle was good for my mental hygiene. I hung up, feeling ashamed of my own neediness. 2 days later, I saw a post on her social media. They had just closed on a ski chalet in Aspen. The caption read, "Investing in family memories." I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. Investing in memories. While I was investing in ramen noodles to survive the week. That was the dynamic. I was the erratic, dangerous daughter who needed to be kept on a short leash for her own safety. They were the benevolent, burdened parents, managing the weight of the world while dealing with a problem child. It was a perfect system, a perfect lie. They had normalized the cruelty so effectively that I didn't even see the bars of the cage. I just thanked them for the scraps they fed me through the slats. But tonight, standing in this ballroom, watching my father toast to a prosperity that was built on my erasure, something in me shifted. The shame was beginning to dissolve, replaced by a cold, hard knot in my stomach. I looked at my mother, who was currently laughing at a joke made by a senator's wife, her hand resting casually on a diamond necklace that could have paid off my student loans twice over. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't manic. I was just poor. And they were rich. And for the first time, I started to wonder if those two facts were connected by something darker than just bad luck. The orchestra swelled into a waltz, the sound filling the cavernous ballroom like rising water. I adjusted the silver tray in my hands, my wrists aching from the weight. I was invisible here, a ghost in a thrifted dress moving between tuxedoed men and women dripping in diamonds. I watched my mother charm a group of investors near the ice sculpture. She threw her head back and laughed, a practiced, glittering sound that I knew meant she was closing a social deal. My father was holding court by the bar, looking every inch the benevolent patriarch. They were radiant. They were untouchable. And then the double doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open with a violence that made the nearest guests jump. The music didn't stop, but the conversation did. A ripple of silence spread outward from the entrance as Grandpa Leo strode into the room. At 78, he moved with the aggressive momentum of a man who had built empires and destroyed competitors before breakfast. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He was wearing a dark charcoal suit that looked sharp enough to cut glass, and he was carrying a walking stick that he clearly didn't need. My parents' heads snapped toward the door. I saw the color drain from my mother's face. They hadn't expected him. Or maybe they had hoped the heavy snow in the pass would keep him away. They started to move toward him, their smiles fixed and brittle, ready to intercept. "Leo," my father called out, his voice a little too loud. "We were just toasting to us." Grandpa Leo didn't even look at them. He walked right past my father's outstretched hand. He walked past my mother's air kisses. He cut through the crowd like an icebreaker ship, his eyes locked on one thing.
Me.
I froze. The tray of crab cakes trembled in my hands. The old panic flared in my chest, the conditioned response to being noticed. What did I do wrong? Is my dress messy? Am I embarrassing them? Grandpa Leo stopped directly in front of me. He looked at the tray in my hands, his lip curling in disgust. Then he looked at my face. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask how I was. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something heavy. He grabbed my free hand, turned my palm up, and dropped the object into it. It hit my skin with a cold, solid weight.
It was a key.
Not a modern, serrated house key, but an antique iron skeleton key, large and dark and smelling faintly of brass polish. It felt ancient. It felt real. "The tenants moved out yesterday," Grandpa Leo said, his voice booming in the sudden quiet of the room. "The final inspection is done. It is all yours, Savannah, just as the trust stipulates." I stared at the heavy iron in my hand. My brain couldn't process the words. Tenants? Trust? I don't understand, I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "What is this?" "The brownstone," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Your brownstone. The one your grandmother left you. It is fully in your name as of midnight tonight." The room went absolutely silent. The kind of silence that has mass and density. I blinked, looking from the key to my grandfather's face. He wasn't smiling. He was watching my parents. "What brownstone?" I asked. At the edge of my vision, I saw my parents freeze. My father's hand was halfway to his mouth with his champagne flute, and it just stopped there, suspended in the air. My mother looked like she had been slapped. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The mask of the perfect, wealthy family didn't just slip. It shattered. For 20 years, I had been told I was a burden. I had been told I was a financial drain, a liability, a girl who couldn't be trusted with a debit card, let alone a historic property. And yet here was this key. It was heavy. It had sharp edges. It was undeniable physical matter. And in that moment, the gaslight flickered. Because if this key was real, then my poverty was a lie. If this key was real, then my parents weren't my caretakers. They were my jailers. You would think that when caught red-handed, a thief would run. Or maybe they would freeze, apologize, or beg for mercy. But my parents aren't common thieves. They are narcissists. And the thing about narcissists is that they don't live in reality, they live in a reflection. When Grandpa Leo dropped that key into my hand, he didn't just expose a crime. He cracked the mirror. And my parents didn't panic. They attacked the crack. The silence in the ballroom lasted exactly 3 seconds before my father, Brian, filled it with a laugh. It was a loud, booming sound, utterly devoid of humor. "Oh, Leo," he said, shaking his head with a pitying smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I think the altitude in Aspen is getting to you. You're confused, old man." He turned to the crowd, raising his hands in a gesture of calm authority. "Everyone, please forgive my father-in-law. He has these moments. The dementia comes and goes." My mother, Alicia, moved instantly. She didn't look at the key. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a terrifying mix of faux concern and steel. She rushed forward, her heels clicking aggressively on the marble floor. "Savannah, honey," she cooed, her voice pitched high for the audience.
Look at you.
"You're shaking. Is it happening again? Are you having one of your episodes?" She reached for me, her hands grasping my shoulders. It wasn't a hug. It was a restraint. "Give me the key, sweetheart," she whispered, leaning close so only I could hear the venom. "You're embarrassing yourself. You're embarrassing us."
Give it to me before you hurt someone.
I stood there, the heavy iron key biting into my palm, and I looked at them. Really looked at them. And that's when I saw it. The module of their madness. Psychologists call it cognitive dissonance. It is the mental stress of holding two contradictory beliefs. My parents believe they are good, upstanding, elite members of society. But they also stole $5.2 million from their daughter. Those two facts cannot coexist. So, to protect their fragile egos from the truth, they had to invent a third reality. I am crazy. In their minds, they didn't steal my money. They stewarded it. They didn't sell my house to cover bad investments. They liquidated it to keep it safe from my manic spending. They weren't lying to the room. They were lying to themselves. And that is infinitely more dangerous. "I'm not having an episode, Mom," I said. My voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. "Of course you are," she hissed, her grip on my arm tightening. I could feel her nails digging into my skin, right through the thin fabric of my thrifted dress. "It would leave a bruise. You're imagining things. There is no brownstone. There is no trust. You're sick, Savannah. Now smile and walk out with me, or so help me God, I will have you committed tonight." It was the same threat they had used for a decade. The ultimate silencer. "Be quiet, or we will lock you away." But tonight, the threat didn't land. It just hung in the air, weightless and absurd, like a ghost story told in the daylight. I looked at her hand on my arm. Then I looked at her face. Her makeup was perfect, but her eyes were frantic. She wasn't scared for me. She was scared of the narcissistic injury, the public humiliation of being exposed as less than perfect. She didn't care if I starved. She only cared if the neighbors knew I starved. I didn't scream. I didn't shrink away like the child they wanted me to be. I simply moved my arm. It wasn't a violent shove. It was a cold, precise retraction. I pulled my arm back, breaking her grip. She stumbled slightly in her heels, her face contorting in shock. "Don't touch me," I said. The room was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the sculptures. "I am not the one who is sick, Alicia. And I am not the one who is confused, Brian." I held the key up, letting the light hit the old, pitted iron. "This key opens a door you told me didn't exist. So either the key is a hallucination, or you are liars. Which one is it?" My father stepped forward, his charming mask dissolving into a snarl. "You ungrateful little—" "Enough," Grandpa Leo interrupted. His voice wasn't loud, but it stopped my father cold. "You want to talk about hallucinations, Brian? Let's talk about the paperwork." He raised a hand, signaling to his assistant by the AV booth. "Let's show the room exactly how confused I am." Grandpa Leo didn't shout. He didn't wave his arms or call for security. He simply raised one finger, a small, sharp gesture directed at the audiovisual booth in the back of the room. The young technician, who had been hired to run a loop of flattering family photos and charity accolades, nodded once. He tapped a key on his laptop. The massive projection screen behind the stage, which had just been displaying a photo of my parents skiing in the Alps, flickered. The image dissolved. In its place, a high-resolution scan of a legal document appeared. It was magnified 10 times its normal size, the black text looming over the tuxedo-clad guests like a judgment. "This," Grandpa Leo said, his voice amplified by the microphone he had pulled from his pocket, "is a deed transfer for the brownstone at 440 West 12th Street. Dated March 12th, 3 years ago." I looked up at the screen. I saw the legal jargon, the property description, and at the bottom, a signature. Savannah. It was a good forgery. It had the right loop on the S, and the sharp crossing of the T. But it wasn't mine. Brian, Grandpa Leo said, turning to my father. You claimed Savannah signed this over to you voluntarily because she was overwhelmed by the responsibility of ownership. Is that correct?
She did.
My father shouted, though his voice cracked. He was sweating now, the sheen visible even under the dim lights. She begged me to take it. She was in a state. She doesn't remember, because she was manic. I stared at the date next to the signature. March 12th. A cold realization washed over me, sharp and absolute. I didn't sign that, I said, my voice cutting through my father's panic. I couldn't have. I turned to the crowd. On March 12th, 3 years ago, I wasn't in a lawyer's office. I was in the emergency room at St. Jude's Hospital. I had slipped on the ice walking to work and suffered a compound fracture in my right arm. My writing hand. I was in surgery at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, exactly when this document was notarized. A murmur went through the room. The alibi was physical, medical, and undeniable. I saw my mother flinch. She knew. She had sent me a text that day, not to ask if I was okay, but to complain that I wouldn't be able to run errands for her. But that is just theft, Grandpa Leo continued, his voice dropping an octave. What comes next is evil. He signaled the booth again.
The screen changed.
This document wasn't a deed. It was a medical evaluation. The header read Psychiatric Competency Assessment. My name was at the top. The diagnosis was highlighted in yellow, bipolar disorder type 1 with psychotic features. Patient lacks capacity to manage financial affairs. Power of attorney recommended. I felt the blood drain from my face. I had never been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. I had never even seen the doctor whose signature scrawled across the bottom. Dr. Marcus Aris. Dr. Aris, Grandpa Leo read aloud. A man who lost his medical license 4 years ago for writing fraudulent prescriptions. A man Brian here paid $15,000 to write this report without ever meeting Savannah. The room went deathly silent. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about personhood. To steal my inheritance, my parents hadn't just forged a check, they had forged a reality. They had legally and medically erased my sanity. They had created a paper trail that declared me broken, incompetent, and dangerous, just so they could justify robbing me blind. I looked at the screen, at the lies typed in neat, official font. Patient exhibits delusions of grandeur. Patient is a danger to her own financial security. It was the ultimate gaslight. They hadn't just told me I was crazy. They had told the state. I looked at my mother.
She wasn't looking at me.
She was looking at the floor, her hands twisting her diamond necklace, terrified not of the crime, but of the exposure. You stole my voice, I whispered. The realization hit me harder than the poverty ever had. You didn't just want the money. You wanted to make sure no one would ever listen to me if I asked for it back. The projector screen went black, but the image of my forged signature seemed to hang in the air, burned into the retinas of every guest in the ballroom. My mother, Alicia, had stopped twisting her necklace. She was staring at the blank screen with the hollow expression of someone watching their house burn down. My father, however, was still trying to find an exit. This is absurd, Brian announced, his voice booming but brittle. He turned to the crowd, flashing that practiced, charming smile that had fooled everyone for decades. My father-in-law is clearly unwell. These documents are fabrications. Deep fakes. We will be speaking to our lawyers in the morning. You can speak to them tonight, Grandpa Leo said calmly. He gestured to the back of the room.
But first you should hear the accounting.
A man in a nondescript gray suit stepped forward from the shadows near the AV booth. I recognized him immediately. He wasn't a guest. He was a forensic accountant from Grandpa Leo's firm, a man named Mr. Sterling, known for finding money that warlords tried to hide. I have tracked the trust fund disbursements, Sterling said, his voice dry and factual, cutting through the tension like a scalpel. The $5.2 million was drained over a period of 12 years. But the brownstone, that was the most interesting asset. He looked directly at my father.
You didn't just hold the deed, Brian.
You leveraged it. You took out 3 separate mortgages against the property, totaling $1.5 million. And then, 18 months ago, You sold it to a shell company in the Cayman Islands to cover your margin calls on a failed cryptocurrency investment. The room gasped. It wasn't just theft. It was incompetence. They hadn't stolen my future to build an empire. They had stolen it to gamble on internet coins and lose. The gala, the clothes, the Aspen estate, it was all a house of cards, held together by debt and my stolen inheritance.
Lies.
My father screamed, the veins in his neck bulging. We are liquid. We are solvent. You are bankrupt, Grandpa Leo corrected. And you are under arrest. As if on cue, the heavy double doors opened again. This time, it wasn't a grand entrance. It was the Aspen Police Department. Four officers walked in, their presence jarring against the silk and velvet of the gala. They didn't draw weapons. They didn't need to. The weight of the law was heavy enough. Brian and Alicia, the lead officer said, stepping onto the marble dance floor. We have warrants for your arrest for grand larceny, forgery, and elder abuse. My mother let out a sound I had never heard before, a high, thin wail of pure despair. It wasn't the cry of a mother losing her child. It was the cry of a socialite losing her status. She looked around the room, her eyes darting from face to face, begging for an ally. But the senators, the investors, the elite friends, they all looked away. They were already rewriting their memories, erasing their association with the couple in handcuffs. The officers moved efficiently. They pulled my father's hands behind his back. The click of the handcuffs echoed louder than the music ever had. They began to march them out, right through the center of the party they had thrown to celebrate their own greatness. As they passed me, my father stopped. He dug his heels into the floor, forcing the officers to pause. He looked at me, his eyes wide and wet with panic. Savannah, he begged, his voice cracking.
Stop this.
Tell them it was a misunderstanding. We are your family. Think of the reputation. Think of what this will do to us. You have to protect the family. I looked at him. I looked at the man who had convinced the world I was crazy so he could buy a ski boat. I looked at the woman who had bruised my arm minutes ago to silence me. I reached into the pocket of my thrifted dress and pulled out the folded copy of the forged psychiatric evaluation. I walked over to the lead officer and tucked the paper into his hand. This is the rest of the evidence, I said, my voice steady and cold. Add it to the file. Then I looked my father in the eye. I am thinking of the family, Dad, I said. I am protecting it from you. 6 months later, the air in the city smelled of rain and wet pavement, a stark contrast to the sterile, conditioned air of the Aspen ballroom. I stood on the sidewalk in front of 440 West 12th Street. The brownstone rose above me, its brick facade scrubbed clean, the windows reflecting the gray sky. It had taken every dime of the recovered funds, plus a significant bridge loan from Grandpa Leo, to buy it back from the shell company. It was empty now. The ghosts of my parents' greed had been exorcised by a team of contractors and a lot of sage. But I wasn't moving in. I stood on the bottom step, holding the heavy iron key, the same one Grandpa Leo had dropped on my dinner plate. It felt warmer now, less like a weapon and more like a tool. Are you ready? I asked. A young woman stood next to me. Her name was Maya. She was 19, aging out of the foster care system, carrying everything she owned in 2 black garbage bags. She looked at the building, then at me, her eyes filled with a defensive skepticism I knew too well. It was the look of someone who expects the rug to be pulled out at any second. You're serious? She asked. This isn't a shelter? There's no curfew? It's not a shelter, I said. It's a transitional housing program. But more than that, it's a home. The second floor is yours. For as long as you need it to get on your feet. I handed her the key. This was the Cycle Breaker Manifesto. This was the only way to truly heal. My parents had used money as a weapon, as a tool for control and erasure. They had hoarded wealth to build a facade of superiority. If I took the money and bought a mansion, if I used it to isolate myself in luxury, I would just be continuing their legacy. I would be letting the money change me, just as it had changed them. But by turning this house into a sanctuary for people like Maya, people who had been told they were burdens, who had been discarded by the systems meant to protect them, I was transmuting the trauma. I was turning the lead of their abuse into the gold of opportunity. Maya took the key. Her fingers brushed mine, rough and cold. She walked up the steps, her boots heavy on the stone. I watched her unlock the massive oak door. It swung open, revealing a hallway bathed in warm light. I sat down on the stoop, watching her walk inside. I thought about the girl in the thrifted dress, holding a tray of appetizers, believing she was broken.
She was gone now. Grandpa Leo was right.
The inheritance wasn't the money. It wasn't the bricks or the mortar. The inheritance was the truth. It was the knowledge that I was strong enough to survive the lie and powerful enough to build something real from the wreckage. I wasn't the unseen heiress anymore. I was the architect. And for the first time in my life, the foundation beneath my feet was solid. If this story of reclaiming your truth resonated with you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to be reminded of their own strength. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice and resilience. See you in the next one.